He just overheard the cashier casually say, treating a terminal illness, the most important thing is not taking medicine, but faith. 65-year-old Harold immediately made a decision. He walked over 600 miles, crossing the entire UK from the southwest to the northeast, to meet a female colleague he hadn't seen in over 20 years, although he didn't carry much cash at the time. His phone was left at home, and he was wearing a pair of leather shoes that were not suitable for walking. But in order not to let this impulsive plan fall apart, he not only didn't go back home, but also didn't intend to tell Maureen. So Harold set out. People often say that fate makes a person repeat the same experiences until a new response is given. When he received a letter from his female colleague in the morning, Harold, who was usually timid and indifferent, initially planned to reply with just a few words and then put it aside. However, this time, he unexpectedly gathered courage and gave a response completely different from the past. Trapped in a lifetime of mediocrity, a life of monotony, an ordinary life. His long-rusted fate will also turned in a miraculous way at this moment. However, he was elderly after all, and had rarely traveled long distances in his life, so just stepping out of his town exhausted all his strength. As night fell, and Harold, knowing there was no turning back, finally dialed the phone to call his wife Maureen, who was waiting anxiously at home. When she learned that her husband was willing to walk over 500 kilometers for another woman, Maureen angrily hung up. But then, memories flooded her mind, and thinking of Harold's weak body, she immediately picked up the phone again. This moment, Harold, with a hint of incomprehensible loneliness, turned and left the phone booth, after barely spending the night in a shabby inn. Harold set out again at dawn. To encourage himself, Harold walked while muttering to himself, repeatedly emphasizing, "I will not die, I still have strength." Initially, this mental victory method was quite effective. However, the weather turned against him, and soon it started drizzling. Seeing this, Harold had no choice but to stop and take shelter under a public eave while inspecting his battered, scarred feet. Suddenly, a little girl dressed as Superman approached him and said that Harold had a certain smell. Harold then realized he hadn't washed in a long time. Immediately, he went to the supermarket to buy cleaning supplies, then found a clean hotel, thoroughly cleaned himself, treated his foot wounds, dried his wet clothes, and finally had a good sleep he hadn't enjoyed in a long time. The next day, he carried a plastic bag filled with personal belongings and set out again. But because Harold had injuries on his feet, walking was quite difficult. Moreover, under the scorching sun, he was almost parched. Fortunately, soon he passed by a house and begged for a glass of water to quench his thirst. The kind-hearted peasant woman who extended a helping hand saw Harold exhausted and invited him to rest in the courtyard, and the two of them chatted for a while. Harold awkwardly expressed, "I have a long way to go, but I haven't mastered the trick yet." The farmer sighed, "The simpler the thing, the harder it is to do it perfectly. Some people can't eat well, often suffer from insomnia, and raising children is the same." Hearing the word children, Harold's eyes suddenly welled up with tears. He remembered his deceased son, recalling those once ordinary, now only cherished memories of happiness. Meanwhile, Maureen was tossing and turning at home, feeling anxious. In fact, for over 20 years, because of the children, although the couple lived under the same roof, they were like strangers. They only exchanged 10 words a day, and apart from daily necessities, almost no communication. But this time, Maureen not only stayed at home for several days, fearing to miss her husband's call, but also took the initiative to soften her tone when answering the phone, sincerely apologized, hoping for his return. However, Harold still refused to go home. In the blink of an eye, Harold had been walking for 3 days, but because he was on foot, he had only traveled a little over 10 miles. However, he seemed to have become less anxious, even acting like a tourist, visiting the most famous local church and buying a crystal pendant for his female colleague. On the morning of the 4th day, hungry Harold arrived at a small restaurant for a meal. At this moment, a middle-aged man suddenly sat across from Harold and said, "You seem like a good person, so I want to tell you a secret. Every Thursday, he comes here to meet a young man, and afterward, they do some things that are not known to others. But today, when he was licking the young man's shoes as usual, he found a hole in the other's shoes. He wants to buy new shoes for him, but is worried about offending him, and asked Harold what he should do. Although startled and wide-eyed, Harold maintained his composure and advised him to buy a new pair of shoes. After this soul-searching ordeal, Harold picked up his belongings and set off again. But not far into his journey, he felt unbearable pain in his feet, each step like torture. Worse still, the searing pain reminded him once more of his son, recalling the moments from happiness to heartbreak, from love to endless quarrels. Finally, under the dual torment of body and mind, Harold could no longer hold on and suddenly collapsed on the sidewalk. Fortunately, a passing lady helped him up and took him home to rest. To express gratitude and dispel the woman's doubts. Harold, upon waking, immediately explained the reason. A few days ago, he received a stranger's letter from his former colleague Queenie. They had worked together at a distillery, often running errands and sharing a good relationship, but then lost contact for decades. Unexpectedly, the letter informed him that Queenie had cancer and was resting in a convalescent home 500 miles away. Harold initially wanted to write to comfort Queenie, but inexplicably decided to visit her in person. After hearing this, the woman sensed that the matter might not be so simple. However, she did not continue to ask, but brought a basin of foot-washing water, preparing to personally treat Harold's foot injury. Seeing Harold repeatedly decline, the woman explained, she was originally a cleaner. Compared to helping people wash their feet, cleaning work was more unbearable for her. Although Harold still felt embarrassed, he no longer refused and accepted her kindness. Moreover, at the woman's insistence on staying, he lingered there for another day. However, what puzzled Harold was that, despite having heard the woman mention her partner, he had never seen her husband. So, when the woman returned home from work, he said with a hint of regret, "It's a pity I haven't met your husband." Unexpectedly, the woman replied, "No matter how long you stay here, you won't see him. A year ago, he left with another woman." It turned out that the woman was originally a doctor from Eastern Europe. To pursue a better life, she came to the UK with her husband. However, her medical background was not recognized here, and she ultimately had to become a cleaner. Worse still, on a regular afternoon, a stranger woman came with a child. She thought her husband would stand firmly by her side, but in the end, it was she who was abandoned. Even so, she was unwilling to leave this place, still holding on to a naive hope that her husband would return someday. Harold said nothing after hearing this, only reaching out his hand silently to offer some comfort. From the woman's words and expression, he judged that she probably would no longer wait blindly in the future. Since Harold had to leave early the next morning, the woman gave him a backpack and a compass to help him better complete the remaining journey. Meanwhile, Maureen, who was at home suffering from worry and anxiety, first went to the hospital and confided in the doctor that she hoped to schedule a medical appointment for her husband. She suspected Harold might have Alzheimer's disease. Otherwise, how could he decide to walk hundreds of miles without warning just to see a colleague? After politely refusing her, the doctor, Maureen found it difficult to endure the torment caused by her overthinking, finally knocked on her neighbor's door, eager to find someone who could listen to her. After explaining her husband's departure, Maureen further revealed that their marriage had actually been nominally over for 25 years. The one who often keeps the words "leave" on their lips is actually Maureen herself, but she has always lacked the courage to put it into practice. Unexpectedly, it was her husband who left first. Moreover, Maureen also admitted with guilt that Queenie had come to her house many years ago, but she had refused her at the time, and she never told her husband about it, fearing that Harold would leave with Queenie and never return. After hearing this, the neighbor comforted Maureen. Harold definitely doesn't want to leave Maureen. There must be another reason for what he's doing. Then, the neighbor suggested driving together to find Harold. However, Maureen refused because she felt Harold wouldn't want to see her. Meanwhile, Harold was unaware of all this, still walking through the bustling city streets. Due to not having eaten for a long time, Harold found a restaurant to satisfy his hunger. After the meal, he started chatting with a passerby he met by chance. Initially, Harold proudly stated that he decided to walk to the nursing home where his cancer-stricken friend was to help him regain his health. He believed that as long as he kept walking, his friend's life could be extended. However, the other person coldly poured cold water on Harold. Although he deeply respects Harold's actions, he himself is a doctor specializing in cancer treatment. Based on his many years of clinical experience, cancer treatment has nothing to do with faith. Once a patient is sent to a nursing home, it means their life is nearing its end. These words caused Harold to collapse instantly. He began to question his original intention, worried that his actions might be futile. In a daze, Harold remembered his son, which brought an unshakable pain and regret. Finally, after wandering in a daze for a long time, he couldn't suppress his disappointment and dialed the nursing home's caregiver again. The last time he called, Harold was full of excitement and hope. This time, he wanted to tell the other person that he had decided to give up completely. However, before Harold could speak, the caregiver on the other end happily told him, "Since learning that you were coming to visit, Queenie, who was on the verge of death, not only woke up, but could also occasionally talk with everyone." It must be admitted that initially, when the caregiver heard that Harold planned to walk to the nursing home, she thought he was a lunatic beyond reason. But now she admits she was wrong. This world indeed needs more people like Harold, who can put aside so-called rationality and embrace pure faith. Hearing that his arrival had improved Queenie's condition, Harold felt reborn, and all his worries and regrets instantly vanished. From then on, he was focused solely on his journey, day and night. Even if he had to beg for food and sleep outdoors after exhausting his savings, Harold found joy in life. When hungry, he could pick wild fruits. When thirsty, he would use the morning fog to moisten his throat. When tired, he simply used the sky as a blanket and the ground as a bed. When cold, he would light a fire to keep warm. Human survival ability is much stronger than imagined. However, just as Harold was gradually getting used to this solitary and peaceful life, a man he talked to posted Harold's story and photos online. As the incident continued to ferment on the internet, more and more people remembered Harold and eagerly offered him food. At first, Harold felt very grateful, as food was his most scarce resource. But on that day, 18-year-old Wilf suddenly asked to accompany him, claiming to have been inspired by God. Although Harold found this reason quite absurd, he did not expose it. At this moment, the appearance of a stray dog allowed Wilf to shift the topic naturally. Looking at Wilf and the stray dog in front of him, Harold immediately thought of his son, because when his son was young, his greatest wish was to raise a dog, but he was repeatedly refused. Thinking of this, Harold felt that perhaps this was some kind of sign, so he no longer refused Wilf and the stray dog to follow him. In the evening, the two stopped to rest and had an in-depth conversation. It turned out that Wilf was an unattended boy who used to hang out all day with a group of idle friends, and unknowingly, he had become involved with illegal substances. However, Wilf emphasized that he had quit and did not want to waste time anymore. After speaking, he sincerely asked Harold for permission to join this pilgrimage. Harold, unable to bear to disappoint the boy, silently agreed to his request. Late at night, the two, with no money, had to camp in the wilderness. However, strange sounds occasionally came from the silent forest, frightening Wilf and making him tremble and cry softly. Seeing this, Harold immediately got up, embraced him like a father, and comforted him gently. Since then, their relationship became much closer. The next day, the two and the dog set out again. On the way, a kind-hearted person prepared a sumptuous meal by the roadside, but Harold only allowed Wilf to take a small portion each time, believing that one should not be too greedy or they might go astray. Wilf was very obedient and never disobeyed Harold's wishes. Unconsciously, they arrived at a new city. Due to overwhelming media coverage, Harold had become a household name, and many citizens came to take photos with him. Moreover, overnight, more than a dozen followers appeared around him, each of whom regarded him as a spiritual support, shouting his name as a slogan, and even sharp-sensed merchants customized uniform team outfits for them. Although he was not used to being surrounded by crowds and did not understand the significance of these people following him, after all, no one besides himself knew Queenie. Harold had no way to escape this noise, so he could only let things continue to happen. That day, when he was forced to stand among the crowd for a photo as usual, he suddenly caught sight of Maureen's figure. It turned out that Maureen had also seen Harold's report on television. At first, Maureen was furious, complaining to her neighbors that she was anxiously waiting for her husband's return, only to find that he was chatting happily with others about his bond with Queenie. Clearly, Maureen was his wife, yet he seemed more like a third party. The neighbors did not comfort her, but sighed wistfully, saying, the last regret of his life was that when his wife was seriously ill and about to pass away, he behaved too calmly. Although his wife was powerless to turn the tide, he should at least have shown some reluctance and grief. If feelings are not expressed verbally, to the other person, it's as if they do not exist. Perhaps unwilling to carry regrets for himself in the future, Maureen finally let go of her worries and went to see Harold. Subsequently, the two entered a coffee shop together. Because they had a quarrel when they parted and only reunited after more than a month, both appeared somewhat awkward and at a loss. In the end, Maureen broke the silence first, unable to contain her feelings, and tearfully expressed her longing, then asked her husband if he could go home with her now. Harold was completely unprepared for Maureen speaking to him in an almost pleading tone, and a slight hesitation arose in his heart. However, thinking of Queenie, who was struggling with her illness, Harold still refused his wife's request. Moreover, Harold even suggested that Maureen could leave with him, but Maureen frankly admitted that she could not be as selfless as her husband. Yet at that moment, she realized that asking her husband to give up this journey was truly selfish. If Harold insisted on proceeding, she decided not to stop him anymore. After saying this, Maureen left a box of bandages and departed. Harold, who set out again, was filled with guilt towards Maureen. Harold couldn't help but question whether this hike was truly necessary, fearing that his momentary stubbornness might cause irreparable harm to Maureen. However, a series of blows followed. That night, he discovered that Wolf not only tried to steal the crystal necklace he bought for Queenie, but also took illegal drugs. Harold had long known that addicts find it very difficult to quit completely, but he still wanted to give Wolf a chance to turn over a new leaf. Unfortunately, Wolf chose to continue sinking deeper. Since then, Wilf, who had suddenly entered Harold's life, disappeared just as suddenly from his world. Unable to resolve his inner worries alone, Harold sought out an older woman in the team to confide in her. After learning the full story, the older woman sincerely said, Harold previously mentioned that he was unwilling to proceed with the main group. She couldn't quite understand that. But now, the entire main group has only traveled 1 mile all day, which clearly doesn't serve Harold's original intention. Therefore, Harold indeed should set out alone. Thus, under the cover of night, Harold quietly left the team with the stray dog. Even if he encountered pedestrians greeting him on the road again, he would pretend to be in a hurry and deny everything, claiming the other person had mistaken him for someone else. However, when he crossed the square covered with fallen leaves and sat on a stone bench beside the station to rest, the stray dog that had been following him suddenly turned around and chased after another lonely woman, quickly disappearing from sight. Although he had long been accustomed to living alone, for Harold, this stray dog was more than just a companion. It was a spiritual support that helped him keep going. Now, with the sudden departure of the stray dog, Harold's faith began to gradually collapse. Deep within his heart, the darkest and dampest memories surged like a flood from a dam, rushing down from above. It turned out that Harold had been abandoned by his parents since childhood. The trauma from his original family prevented him from ever learning how to love. Therefore, after his son was born, he was never able to truly assume the role of a father. Initially, although his son lacked paternal love, he did not become gloomy or extreme because of it. On the contrary, under Maureen's careful care, his son grew up sunny, cheerful, and proactive, even managing to get into Cambridge University in England through his own efforts. However, as academic pressure increased, his son gradually fell into alcoholism and drug abuse, and his temper became more and more irritable. Faced with his son's changes, Harold not only failed to provide timely guidance and comfort, but also accused his son of going astray, causing their father-son relationship to deteriorate rapidly. Harold thought that as long as his son dropped out of school, he could return to the right path. Unexpectedly, on an ordinary afternoon, his son hanged himself from a beam in the basement. Since then, Maureen also seemed to have changed. The pain of losing her son made her feel unbearable every day, and she could only constantly vent her feelings to Harold. Harold, on the other hand, became even more silent, even completely shutting himself off. Thus, the relationship between the couple fell into a deadlock. Thinking of this, Harold, who was walking forward in the rain with his head down, suddenly stopped. He had lost the courage to continue. However, when Harold called Maureen, expressing a desire to give up, Maureen encouraged him. According to the location your husband mentioned, he is only 18 miles away from the destination. Since he set out, he has been walking for exactly 62 days. Why give up at the last moment? Moreover, Queenie is still waiting for him there. After a brief silence, Maureen continued. There was something she didn't want to tell her husband, but if she didn't say it now, Maureen was afraid her husband would regret it for the rest of his life. Queenie had come to our house before leaving to find Harold. Queenie asked Maureen to tell Harold not to blame himself, that they had always been good friends. Although his wife didn't know what had happened between them, at that time their son had just passed away, and Maureen was jealous that her husband had someone to comfort him, while she had none, so she didn't pass on this news to her husband. This speech rekindled Harold's determination to move forward. After a long journey of over 500 miles on foot for 87 days, he finally arrived at the nursing home. Just as he was about to press the doorbell, Harold realized his own weariness, so he went to a coffee shop to use the restroom and tidy himself up, only to be chased out by the staff who mistook him for a beggar. As Harold left in despair, a baby in a cradle held in someone's arms made him think of his own son. The suppressed emotions of decades burst forth at that moment, and Harold finally broke down, crying uncontrollably. Unable to find someone to confide in, he took out a pen and wrote a letter to the cashier at the front desk, detailing the whole story. 25 years ago, Harold, due to inaction, watched helplessly as his son hanged himself. Unable to forgive himself, Harold drank to drown his sorrow but couldn't quell his regret, and deliberately smashed the company's warehouse of alcohol, seeking severe punishment. Queenie, a colleague who knew Harold's pain of losing his son, took the blame for him and was eventually fired, while Harold stood by and dared not clarify. This matter was like a thorn in his throat. For years, Harold had been unable to face it, until the cashier said that Faith had saved her critically ill aunt. Everyone thought Harold had walked hundreds of miles out of love for Queenie, but in fact, he was atoning for his past mistakes. This thank you letter made the girl receiving it feel uneasy. Faith saved my aunt was just her casual remark, but Harold took it seriously. Afraid that the truth would deeply hurt Harold, she immediately went to consult Harold's wife, Maureen, and upon learning the truth, Maureen also fell into deep unease. Meanwhile, mentally prepared, Harold, guided by the nursing home aide, finally met Queenie after decades of separation. Queenie was now emaciated and lifeless, with no sign of vitality. She couldn't speak or move, like a shell that could still breathe. In an instant, Harold's faith was completely shattered, but he still endured his grief silently, sitting quietly beside Queenie, offering her one last warmth. Moreover, Harold hung the crystal pendant he brought by the sunlit window, then left the hospital room in a dazed state. Gazing at the distant, tumultuous waves, Harold once again fell into self-doubt. He had thought that as long as he walked across the entire England, he could save a dying person. However, the reality is that he couldn't even save his own SONAT this moment. Maureen quietly came to his side. Feeling her husband's self-blame for being unable to change the past, Maureen sincerely said, "No matter what the final outcome is, it is already a miracle that my husband can bravely step out of the house and measure every inch of England with his own feet. If you really ask what he gained from this journey," Maureen looked seriously at her husband, "it is her deeper love and admiration, as well as the courage and experience that most people can hardly attain in a lifetime. What life carries is never the ending, but every moment in the course of life. How it ends has never been the most important thing. The process of reaching the end is what is most worth cherishing."